Today we had a kind of breaking news change of topic. We were going to be talking about something else, but because of the outbreak going on in Iran and Israel, and Dr. Marc Gafni spent pretty much all of yesterday on calls with people throughout the Middle East, and he just came back from a trip to visit family in Israel. So he has a very grounded and deep perspective on everything that's going on there. So he wanted to take today to shift our focus to the very important pressing issues going on the globe right now. So we will be talking about the Iran and Israel conflict and not what that just means in terms of what's happening right there, but what that also means in the grand story of humanity and where we are at as a
It's
globe.
a wild moment we're in, isn't it, everyone? It's great to be with everyone. This week, I had intended to talk about the nature of a spiritual community. What is a mystical society? What is a spiritual community? It's an enormously important topic in terms of the news story of value, but we got a little superseded now, by events in Israel and Iran. But I want to say a couple of things about why I want to talk about this for a second. Towards the end of 2006 and the beginning of 2007, I made a commitment to myself that I have not kept. I made a kind of solemn promise, which I've broken. And the promise was just to stop teaching. And the reason I made that promise to myself to stop teaching is because I was disappointed in some fundamental way. I was more devastated than disappointed, in the inefficacy, the lack of effect of teaching. And I had seen, people who should know better, right? Who spoke words that were the right words, in the human potential movement and the New Age movement, just kind of lose touch with, a basic sense of what George Orwell called decency. And I was like, wow. And I saw it in multiple contexts, around the world. I both had direct contact with it, but also saw it in multiple other contexts. And I said, God, right? Like this is not the way I should be spending my time. Right. The world is in desperate need of repair, of fixing, of tikkun, right? There's tikkun, fixing, repair, transformation. There's desperate suffering around the world. So what am I going to do? So I picked one issue that actually someone that I knew at the time. It was the mayor of a particular American city, and we jogged together here and there. And he had actually engaged this issue. He had spent a lot of time on it. I was familiar with the issue, but his passion for it kind of opened my eyes to it in a way that I wasn't quite aware before, which is the issue of human trafficking, and labor slavery and sexual slavery around the world. And I spend about a year and a half, but in my own, both engaged, about a few months engaged with him, this particular person, but much more time with myself and calling other people. And I kind of said, okay, I started a little bit naively, maybe a lot naively, and said, we're gonna solve human trafficking. I'm gonna wrap my heart and mind around it, and we are going to, rally, funding and global coordination and global organization and really handle human trafficking. We're taught around the world, particularly in Western countries. One example is the United States, but another example is England and in Western Europe that, slavery ended. In the United States, when you learn history in school, slavery ended at a particular moment, the Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln. What year was it? 1861, something like that. Abraham Lincoln with the Civil War. But of course, that's not true. There are more slaves in the world today. There are more people in the world, obviously, than there were in 1861. There are also more slaves in the world than there ever were, both labor slaves and sexual slaves around the world that are being trafficked. And I spend, again, about a year kind of reading everything I could on it. And I failed. And I failed for many reasons. There were many reasons for that failure, but two of them I want to note. One is I didn't have enough power. Does that make sense? I simply didn't have enough power to move, the levers of reality, right, to affect a significant change. Second, when I spoke to various figures, all of whom shall remain nameless, were kind of prominent in the movement around the world, what I found was that underneath the great cause of redeeming and liberating slaves, there was an enormous egoic competition, about who the liberator would be. There was an enormous competition for, both for funds and for limelight and for spotlight and for credit. And it was just kind of shocking. But three, and this is the third, right? And this is the one that kind of was most shocking to me. I'm not going to go into it now, but I realized that even these people I was talking to, when we would go deeper into conversation, they knew that slaves needed to be liberated, but actually they didn't have a deep and real sense that value was real. And that was like, and as even though they were fighting for value, for liberating slaves, you would think, okay, that's right. That they got that was important, but there was this deeper sense of malaise. And it wasn't just in the people who were fighting the battle, but in order for sexual slavery and labor slavery to exist, you need collusion all over the world, right? And you need governments, customs, various navies, money laundering, turning away politicians refusing to pass laws in particular places, right? There's many, many players. There's a vast system, right, of political, economic, and social benefit, right, that keeps the system in place. And actually, in order to dismantle it, you would have to have a fierce stand for value itself. You'd have to actually really get this is not the way it is. It won't always be this way. This is not the nature of the world. You would have to have a vision that the world could be different, that there was a true, right, and real possibility, right, of a different and better world. Does that make sense, everyone? Right? And you would have to let go of the kind of cynical exhaustion that plagued many of the best people who in their heart of hearts didn't believe it could really change. They couldn't quite hold the vision. I understand why. I'm not critiquing them. And you would require multiple vectors of people around the world, you with me, everyone, to actually take a stand for value and to have their moral and political, right, and social will aroused, by value. And the overwhelming majority of people I was talking to simply didn't believe that value was ultimately real. It was about well-being, it was about, they had all sorts of words, but basically, the what I'm called the common sense sacred axioms of modernity, which ignored the issue of whether value was real and just said, let's just assume it's real. And modernity, took a social loan, as we've described it here before, from pre-modernity, to just assume value is real, right? To hold these truths to be self-evident, even if we can't source them in anything, right? That was insufficient, right? A Jeffersonian view of value, Thomas Jefferson, right, was insufficient. Jefferson's view of value is rooted ultimately in Epicurus and other, pre-Socratic thinkers, other Stoics, and it just didn't cut it. And the John Adams, right, who was the second president, Thomas Jefferson was the third, the John Adams view that value is real had actually been shunted aside. And so I realized it's not going to happen. I won't be able to accomplish this, right? Which was devastating to me for all three of those reasons. And as right around that time, I began to look carefully at, what we now call the meta crisis or existential risk. I had given a series of lectures at Vanuatu, right? You remember Shahat, on how the failure to articulate a vision of self, unique self, particularly a vision of who we are, the failure to articulate a vision of eros or eros value, the failure to articulate a sense of the universal love story, the failure to articulate kind of a worldview, right, was actually the fundamental cause for existential risk. And, Malc, right, who was there at those lectures, he wrote a book, on, the second shock of existence and unique self. It emerged out of his own thinking and out of those talks, I think. The first shock of existence is the realization that we die, the realization of death, the death of the individual human being. The second shock of existence, right, some X thousands of years later, right, the second shock of existence, the first one's at the dawn of history. And the second shock of existence is actually right now, which is not the threat of the death of the individual human being, but the death of humanity. Everyone with me so far? So the first shock of existence pressed us into the realization of death, pressed us into life. Death is not an accident, right? The fact that there's an experience of death which is actually a night between 2 days, right? That there's an interruption in our knowing directly, immediately, the continuity of consciousness. That we actually have an experience that someone dies, and at least for the most part, we don't have access to them. There are other vectors of communication that have been investigated and that have actually appeared and been disclosed over time and have been studied extensively in modernity in parapsychology. And one should take a look at the best summation book on parapsychology, which is serious and credible, as the great Whiteheadian scholar David Ray Griffin wrote an excellent book on parapsychology. So we actually know now more about the continuity of consciousness, but death is not an accident. Death is not just something we vanquish. Death is an actual experience that presses us into life. And all of culture and all of the depth of realization about who we are, who am I? Where am I? What ought I do? The three great questions, what we call the three great questions of cosmoerotic humanism, would never have been asked and never would have been responded to had we not had an experience of death. Does everyone get that? So the experience of the first shock of existence, tell me if you've got the sentence, presses us into life, in which we disclose new gnosis, new knowing about the nature of life and the nature of death and the nature of identity, right? The who question, the nature of where, the nature of reality, where we are, and then the normative question, meaning what ought I do? Does that make sense, everyone? So in the same way, the second shock of existence, meaning the potential death of our humanity, right, needs to, and this was my realization back in 2008 and 9, needs to press us into a re-engagement with these three great questions. Who am I? Where am I? What ought I do? Those three questions that were answered in ethnocentric ways in the medieval world. Each nation, each religion answered them in their own way, but there were certain common features, but they were ethnocentric. It was me and my people, and we were going to triumph in our vision of the world. Our fairy tale of the world was our triumph, and everyone joins our cause, and then we create a better world with everyone obeying our God and our laws and our rules. But there was a sense of intrinsic value. There was a sense of meaning that collapsed in modernity. We thought we could get away with it. We thought we could borrow social capital from pre-modernity, just assume value was real. Jefferson thought Epicurus will get us through, and we'll have this world of immense and amazing progress into the future, and we'll create this utopia, this heaven on earth. But of course, that turned out not to be true, because we failed to articulate a new story of value. And we could get away with it in modernity, but post-modernity came and called in that loan. Does that make sense, everyone? This is the basic premise of One Mountain, right? Of who we must become. Postmodernity came and called that loan and said, you guys don't have a story of value, right? You don't have, right? And you can get away with that for a couple hundred years. But when postmodernity said, actually, you guys have been lying, you can't get away with it anymore. We're calling the loan, right? Actually, value is not real. Actually, it's all about power, right? Actually, right? Nothing happens after death. That's actually contrived, right? In other words, postmodernity assumed, beginning with, it has many roots, but let's trace it to neo-Darwinism, through logical positivism and through multiple other strands, through existentialism, into postmodernity. There's about 10 other strands, but basically the assumption was this life is all there is. There's no ultimate meaning. Everything is ultimately arbitrary. We are an irrelevant speck of dust in a vast cosmos, right? Nothing ultimately matters intrinsically and inherently. And Sartre writes an amazing volume that blew my heart open, but is tragic, called Being and Nothingness, where he says that human responsibility means that you have to basically embrace the fact that you're making the whole thing up. In any kind of reliance on any kind of intrinsic value, intrinsic meaning, right? Intrinsic truth, right? That actually is an abandonment of responsibility. That was the existential moment, right? Mother died today, or was it yesterday? A text I've cited often at the beginning of Camus' book, The Stranger, right? There was this realization that we're strangers are we, George Steiner, errants at the gates of our own psyche, right? We're social constructs. We're made up. Harari, that I've quoted often, comes out of that, and he says, and he italicizes any meaning, any value we ascribe to our lives is mere delusion. So that's the postmodern calling of the loan. You with me so far, everyone? So in that realization, right, just for me personally, I realized, oh, okay, I get it. What actually needs to be done is, right, we need to step out of any particular tradition as interpreters of just that tradition. And that realization, of course, matched my biography at the time, right? And we need to actually create a shared story of value. We need to go deep into every great religious tradition, but we also need to go into systems theory and into complexity theory, right? And into chaos theory. And we need to go into, right, the new realizations of quantum mechanics, which are superposition, right, and quantum entanglement, right? And we need to go into the depth of biochemistry, which is probably more important than anything else. Biochemistry, more important than anything else, or what Dennis Noble calls systems biology, right? The professor at Oxford, or James Shapiro calls, right, the new view of evolution, which emerges from those who rejected the neo-Darwinian reductive materialism of Thomas Huxley, and the Russian prince, right? Kropotkin, who writes about the mutual aid, and it begins an entire heterodox, more correct reading of Darwin's later book, right, Descent, and the early Darwinian notes from the diaries, right, and kind of develops with James Mark Baldwin, and then followed by Charles Sanders Peirce, the great polymath, right, and those two, by the way, birthed Piaget. Really, Baldwin births Piaget and goes to Alfred North Whitehead, right, and so there's this heterodox lineage, right, bring together the best of what I call the interior sciences, and we begin to create a new story of value, and that new story of value, right, becomes a shared story of value that we can actually show to be valid. It's non-dogmatic, it's empirical, you can access it. It draws on all of the great traditions. It weaves them together. It doesn't abolish the great traditions. Taoism continues, and Christianity in its various forms continues, and the best of Sunni and the best of Shiite, right, kind of in their best forms, right, continue, and the best of Judaism continues, and the best of, right, of the African, right, great traditions continue, et cetera, right? But actually, not in their dogmatic forms, but actually their best realizations are woven together into a shared story of value, which is a shared sheet of music, out of which 1 billion instruments, 1,000 instruments, 100 instruments, 100 systems can play their unique instruments in this unique self symphony. and stay with me, and in a world in which we are unbearably intimate with each other. We're unbearably intimate with each other, right? Meaning there's no place to hide. There's no place to go, right? There's no place to run away to, right? There's no gingerbread house on any continent. It's one world. And therefore, it's either one destruction, one dystopia, or one heaven on earth, right? In other words, it's a world in which we're all connected to each other, right? The elites won't escape in their bunkers, right? We need to actually create a shared story of value in which we all participate, in which we actually are rooted in eternal value, which is evolving value. We've talked a lot about that. I'm not going to talk about it now, right? And we actually come together and we can have a conversation with each other. Does that make sense? So because of that, I kind of made a decision for a while. We did quite a bit of current events, here in One Mountain, right? Is that true? Right? We did quite a bit of current events. We talked about a lot of things going on around the world. And at a certain point, the last major current event we did was I just couldn't resist was a kind of devastating critique of Stephen Miller, right? And the way he talks about immigration, which is kind of a disaster, right? But we did a lot on COVID, a lot on conspiracy theory, right? We did on Ukraine. Lane and I did a book on Ukraine, right? In other words, we did all through the years quite a lot, right? And then at a certain point, I stopped. And I didn't stop because I stopped caring. We did Roe versus Wade and abortion, right, et cetera. But I didn't stop because we stopped caring. We stopped because we care so much. Does that make sense? In other words, yes, Benjamin, we did democracy, right? I stopped because I realized, right, whenever I go into a topic, right, first off, it takes me an enormous amount of time because I can't talk about anything unless I've read 1,000 things on it and thought about it, enormously. So I don't want to just talk. I don't want to talk about something unless I can get to the core of it, right? And then actually say something new that changes and shifts the conversation in some fundamental way. So what I did was I recommended, a few vectors of information and on various topics that are worth looking at, right? I said, take a look at, Chaviv Rettingur, right, who does, very good commentary, right, on Israel, right, who criticizes the Israeli government constantly, but gives a good, right, sense, right, of that world. Sam Harris, right, does also a very good job actually on Israel, and I et cetera, right? And I tried to recommend a bunch of vectors, not just on Israel, but in both private and public conversations, right? Where you can kind of go look for, and it's very hard to find good commentary on anything, right? If you want to look at the Ukraine, I think Kasparov, right, the chess champion, right, who actually just did a dialogue with Harris with Sam, is very important on the Ukraine. The Ukraine is absolutely critical, right? The Ukraine war is far from over. It's a horror, right? If you want to look at the Sudan, right, Nicholas Kristof, right, is actually quite important. He's doing a very, very, very good and important job. And there are people doing some really good work. But I decided, just internally, in terms of my heart and mind, that the desperate need, truly the desperate need, and I want you to, if you can get with me, the word desperation, desperate, like utterly, totally desperate, right? The desperate need, right, to articulate a new story of value, not as an intellectual project, not as a kind of intellectual masturbation, not as a kind of, demonstration of, intellectual prowess, but, in other words, not as kind of someone kind of desperately alone in their apartment, kind of seeking attention, which is what happens so often, right? This kind of flailing for attention. None of that. No. We're madly in love with reality. We're madly in love with reality. We're madly in love with every individual human being and every individual person, right? And if we don't articulate a new ground of value, if we don't solve value theory, or if we don't create a new identity theory, if we don't create a new theory of eros, of relationship, if we don't create new visions of economics and governance, right? If we don't create, right, in other words, et cetera, if we don't actually articulate what are the first principles and first values, right, that upon which the whole thing is based. And in order to do that, we have to bootstrap. We have to actually go into 5, 6, 7 major vectors of thought that got stuck, that got stultified, that got ossified, right, in academic departments themselves, kind of corrupt and funded and, kind of vying in their own egoic game. We've got to blow that out of the water. We got to create a kind of new Florentine Platonic academy like they did in the Renaissance, like Marcello Ficino did, and Pico della Mirandola and Leonardo da Vinci. Of course, they were funded by Medici, right? We need some Medicis, right? Desperately. And we have to, and we got to go into this. So Zach and I, as we were talking about this, and many of us who are around this table who are here, we said, okay, that's what we have to do. We got to put every drop of energy into that. And so I follow, those of you who know me closely, I follow events around the world insanely, carefully, right? I've been following, for example, Sudan, which is just a complete horror. Probably 500,000 people killed in Sudan in the last several years, right? In, one of the greatest tragedies in the Islamic world. It's not covered at all. Barely, I mean, it barely gets attention, but the horror of Sudan barely gets attention, right? And the probably 50,000 people, right, just destroyed in Iran, right, didn't even vaguely get the attention, since the December, January, didn't get even the vague amount of attention, right, that was given to other things happening in the world, right, which had other agendas driving them. But in other words, the amount of suffering in the world is unimaginable. And I try and track everything I can everywhere. And I feel it, and I pray it, and I meditate it, and I swallow it, and I breathe it, and then I go back right to the new story of value. And for me, if I can just be, I apologize for being just so, I want to, before I die, I want to leave in the world with you together, not me doing it myself, all of us together. And we created a name, right? It's not, fuck Gafni. It's not about Gafni, right? Or Stein or Wilbur, right? It's David J. Temple. David J. Temple. And we're all in various ways doing David J. Temple together, right? Just like somehow Shakespeare got created. Shakespeare, enormously beautiful. And I believe that Lane is going to be doing some work over the years about interpreting Shakespeare and bringing Shakespeare's sonnet in conversation with the Dharma, with Eros value. But in other words, or Shimon Bar Yochai, right, who was considered the author of the Zohar, but actually there were a group of people, right, who actually called themselves Shimon Bar Yochai. There was a community, there was a band of outrageous lovers, right, who sat around the table, as it were, the table of history, and said, we're gonna actually evolve the source code. And the Zohar went into the mystery schools of Christian Kabbalah and actually formed the Renaissance. And Pico della Mirandola, right, for example, a key figure, right, in the Florentine Platonic Academy, is studying with Jacob Megiddo and Yochanan Alamano, right, who are in the Solomon lineage, for example. But the point is, right, let's actually create David J. Temple. Let's actually create an artifact. Let's create an angel. Let's create together, right, this force, and then pour into it, right, the deepest distinctions that are possible. That makes sense, everyone? The utterly deepest distinctions that are possible. Zach was just in Davos, and he said to me, should I go to Davos? And he went to a conference, which was not the World Economic Forum, but it was a kind of, off-World Economic Forum. It was a conference that happened at the same time. And he was sharing there, a lot of kind of the basic distinctions we've been making here about artificial intelligence. And there was one person, name doesn't matter, but one person who's kind of a key figure in this field, and who kind of heard the set of distinctions, said, this is the best thing I've ever heard at Davos. Any place, anywhere, I'm going to take these talk points and share them everywhere. It was just a beautiful example of kind of, maybe like the key figure in this kind of artificial intelligence social media conversation, right, receiving the distinctions and kind of running with them. It was beautiful. And so we've tried to, right, in like literally 7 or 8 vectors, right, actually crack open and then begin to articulate, right, the shared story of value, which needs to get to China, to the ruling circle, and it needs to get throughout Russia, and it needs to get throughout Africa, and it needs to get deep in Iran, right, and deep in, right, every country in the world, right, and it has to be not us, we get to disappear, but it has to be downloaded into the source code of culture. And so literally just my own, if I can be just revelatory, I apologize, just for a second, my own experience of life is a race with death, right? I feel like I'm in a race with death, and, I hope I don't die in the next couple of years, or the next couple of days or the next couple of weeks. I would like to live for 30 more years, right? Who knows, right? Who knows? My friend Michael Murphy is, I don't know, he's doing well. And someone just texted me, who shall remain nameless, and just talked to me about a friend of hers who just passed away at 100. That'd be more than 30 years, but I'm a bit more, quite a bit more. But in other words, but you get the right. In other words, I don't know how much time we have, and so literally, and KK, right? KK, are you here? You're probably on her phone. She can't type, right? I mean, literally, right? I do 18 hours a day, all the time, every day, just struggling to kind of hold the pieces together, right? And I would say I'm now myself personally, I'm personally now probably between about 18 manuscripts that are moving around in my mind. And I've got a couple of really great partners, some awesome partners, right, who are brilliant. And I'm not going to start to list them because they're all here and I'll forget someone and I'll get in big trouble and I'll feel terrible for the next 6 weeks. But I'm working with brilliant partners, with Zach Stein, but with many other brilliant partners who are here, who were David J. Templing together, which is why, right, I don't take time to address particular issues. Right now, why did I need to say all that? Right. Well, because I don't want to talk about the Israel-Iran thing, which I'm going to do, because I happen to be, I have an old relationship to Israel. Right. I don't think that the suffering in Israel is more important than the suffering in Sudan. And I don't think that the suffering in, Gaza, Israel, right, is more important than the suffering in the Ukraine. But that's really important to say. That's why I did all this, right? In other words, so the reason, right, no one's blood, as I've said many, many times, no one's blood is redder than anyone else's blood. And Congo and Myanmar are insane, right? My dear friend Inika, just talked about, Congo and Myanmar, which are, you just think about what's going on in kind of each of these places, and you don't even know what to say. So in Myanmar, right, the civil war starts in 2021, right? Probably about, I don't know, 90,000 people, right, have been killed, right? It's this it's street protests into kind of a very sophisticated multi-front war. There's ethnic armed groups against the People's Defense Forces, and it's an utter, horror. Right. It's a nationwide uprising against kind of the military junta, that's, seized power there. And it's so intense. And yes, it's so great, Inika, that you're so in that and that you're in the Congo. Right, the Congo, there's this new resurgence of violence, fueled by the M23 kind of rebel group, tens of thousands of direct deaths and millions more, dying, from the collapse of the regional health system. Right. And that this goes back to, and these are the fundamental tensions between the DRC and Rwanda. And so that's critical. So thank you, Inika. And by the way, here in the United States where I live, right, although there's so far 3 people have been killed, right, who should not have been killed. It was a horror. All 3 people who were killed by ICE agents were a horror, right? There's no reason they should have been killed. It's murderous. Right. And deportation and immigration is a very complex issue. Right. Obama deported more people than anyone else. But the way what's happening in the United States is happening, right? ICE is the 3 people, right, that were killed by the special task force, created by President Trump in order to engage in deportation. Right. And again, the issue Trump was addressing is an issue that Biden tried to address and Obama tried to address. And actually in 3-4 years, there actually were, right, an enormous amount of people let into the United States who were, right, violent in a very, very serious way. But that has nothing to do. Obama recognized that, Biden did, and Trump did. But the way this has been done and the 3 people that were killed in the United States is obviously a horror. And actually democracy, right, is, right, being challenged in very serious ways in the United States, which is a different conversation, right? But my point is, so I'm not picking this conversation because, right, obviously Renee Nicole Good, who was killed, and Alex Jeffrey, right, I think Brett, who was killed, and Ruben, right, Ray Martinez, who was killed, right? I mean, there's an enormous amount to say about that. I wanted to stop and talk about each one of those, right? right. So like, so there's these are all critical. So I'm not choosing this issue, right, because it's the only issue. Does everyone get that? And it was important enough for me to transmit that, to spend it all the time we just had to kind of locate us where they are. Does everyone get that? We good? And again, I'm going to be very clear. So I'm going to be very clear what I'm going to do now. Okay. So let me just go a little slower. If you want to understand a very good critique of what, Trump did here, if you want to understand, like, okay, where are their flaws, right, in what's happened here, which are very serious, and where is there kind of some genuine, corruption at play here that needs to be called out, I would suggest, right, take a look, February 28th, 2026, read Rachel Maddow's article. She gets about 6 or 7 things wrong in the article, but the issues she raises are real, right? She's a good representation of kind of the neoliberal American critique of Trump, which is quite serious. The article is excellent, right? I read it, and 10 others, in the middle of the night, and marked it up. It's worth reading. I read about 10 other pieces like this. It's a legitimate and important critique. You should read it. So that's one. When we'll send it to people, when we send this episode out, we'll send you the article. So that's I'm not going to engage that critique. It's been made in many places. I'm not going down that road. Okay. And it's one of the reasons I hesitate to step into an issue, because there's so much to say and so many dimensions to it that it's almost impossible to engage in a short period of time. I think on the Ukraine, we did 5 or 6 weeks. Okay. But I want to try and understand a little bit of the issues here. And you'll see why, because I want to understand them in the context of the need to establish a shared story of value. The same way we talked about immigration, right, in that context. And the same thing could and should be done for the Sudan, and the same thing could and should be done for Russia and the Ukraine. And we could actually turn this forum into doing that every week. But I don't think we would change the conversation. Does everyone get that? I don't think we change the conversation in Congo, right, in Myanmar, et cetera. I don't think we would change the conversation. I don't think, and then we can go to China and the amount of people killed in detention camps in China, right, as they're oppressing one particular Muslim minority, right? And then the Chinese Communist Party, which itself is essentially a criminal organization, fundamentally. And then let's not even begin to talk about Putin, right? So, but the reason I'm not, and believe me, right, I'm not outraged. I'm in, I spend my days moving between kind of mad joy, because I'm insanely ecstatic to be alive, and I'm madly in love with the world, and I love people, and I love, the birds and the daffodils and right, in other words, all of it, right. I love reality. I'm also just in massive pain. And so, every day I cry out of one side of my mouth and I laugh out of the other side of my mouth, and joy and ecstasy and unimaginable pain live together. Right? That's the nature of what it means to be a human being, probably since the beginning of time, and certainly in this moment in time. Right. So I'm just noting, read the Rachel Maddow critique. Okay. So it's worth reading, and it's important.
I hope you're enjoying this episode with Dr. Marc Gafni. I have 2 amazing opportunities for you. One, if you are brand new here, and the other, if you are someone who is ready for a deep dive at the cutting edge of philosophy, religion, spirituality, and science. Number 1, if you are brand new here and you are enjoying this depth of philosophical inquiry and discussion, then every single Sunday, Dr. Marc Gafni does a free live stream. You can get the link to that by going into the description below this video. Also, if you are new here and you want to familiarize yourself with the work that Dr. Marc Gafni and his colleagues at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion are working on, then I highly recommend you get one of our intro books. The one that I would like to speak about right now is called The Evolution of Love: From Quarks to Culture, The Rise of Evolutionary Relationships in Response to the Meta Crisis. All of the philosophy that we are writing here at the center is about how to respond to the meta crisis, which is the current state of the globe, where we have so many different global systems that are approaching failure, and all of them are interconnected. And the question is, how do we respond? And this book does an amazing job of giving you clarity on the global situation and then talking about how you and your personal relationships can start to change the world literally by just your personal interactions. So if you're new here, sign up for the free live teachings every Sunday and also get yourself a copy of The Evolution of Love. Now, if you're somebody who's been studying with Dr. Marc Gafni for some time, or maybe you just found Dr. Marc Gafni, but you realize these teachings have a depth unlike anything else going on the planet right now, because they are bringing together all of the different fields of gnosis, from philosophy to science to religion to psychology, all coming together to write a solution to the root problems that are causing the meta crisis. Then there is only one event that you should be at every single year, and it is our live week-long deep dive retreat with Dr. Marc Gafni. This year it's happening from April 20th to April 24th in Holland, Europe, and you will be able to study directly with Dr. Marc Gafni, surrounded by an amazing community, a gorgeous location, and we will be diving so deep into the cutting edge of philosophy, science, religion, where they all come together. This is what we call the yearly mystery school. If you're interested in being at the cutting edge of culture and consciousness, this is the place to be. Click the mystery school link in the description and we will send you more information. Enjoy the rest of this episode.
So now I want to turn to and what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend this week, next week, minimally these 2 weeks, maybe the week after, we'll see where we are. But I want to try and talk about the issues here a little bit. I won't get it all done now, but I want to at least begin. The best estimates I've been able to find is somewhere between, and it's, and give me one second, Krista, it's actually kind of a horror to even say between 40 and 50,000 people is a horrific thing to say. Just to say that phrase is horrible. You're talking about 10,000 people, each life. Anyone who saves one life is as if they've saved the entire world, says the lineage. Right? To even say the phrase 40 to 50,000 people is a horror. That's a horrific phrase, right? It's obscene to even talk that way. But somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people in the last weeks, right? The best of Iran, which is one of the great problems today in terms of what is happening and what Israel and the United States are doing, which I think is probably necessary, right? Necessary, right? Which I think is fundamentally, as many people have said publicly, in both, from Chuck Schumer, the head of the Democratic majority, it has, he addressed the moral necessity despite his repugnance for Trump, and a number of European leaders and people all over the world, and I know the situation, quite well, I've tracked it for probably 25 years. One of the things I've tracked very closely, right? Iran's commitment is to the glorification of what Hamas did. Hamas was funded about $100 million a year, by Iran, right? Hamas is a complete proxy of Iran. And Iran was ecstatic when Hamas, right, went and knifed women in the vagina, right, as they cut their breasts off and burned their babies. Yes, that is what happened. My son was there the next day. There was an ecstatic victory, right? That was an ecstatic victory. But that's unimaginable that anyone could consider that an ecstatic victory, right? And women, and the sexual violence, right? That was perpetrated against the hostages in the tunnels, right, by Hamas. Also a great victory, right? The horror, there hasn't been that kind of violation, right, that was seen by the entire world, that was celebrated or ignored, right? Or somehow dismissed, right? And that's Iran. And what Iran has done, right, just killing, raping, right, even as it goes against their entire kind of repressive sexual code, right? 15-year-old girls, right? We talked about Masha Amini, right? A couple of years ago. So about 40 to 50,000, right? Young people have been killed. The best, right? People the most courageous, the ones who sacrifice the most, who step forward, have been slaughtered. I mean, slaughtered on the streets of Iran, right? And Iran's fundamental commitment, right? Fundamental commitment is to destroy Israel, but to destroy Israel is not a local issue. Israel is actually directly connected to the fundamental, right, stability of the world in multiple vectors, but particularly the Middle East, which then affects the rest of the world. It's one world. So when someone says, "Oh, why are we taking on Iran? It's got nothing to do with us. They don't have ballistic missiles that can reach the United States," right? Right. AKA one of the weaker parts of Rachel Maddow's article. That completely misunderstands, right, the nature of the world today. Right. So the horror of what's going on just on moral grounds, not on moral grounds, is a horror. And Maddow's challenge was, she says, I don't believe that's what moved Trump. That's a separate issue. I don't know what moved Trump. But what Maddow and I agree on 1,000% is that there's sufficient moral ground, right, to step in. And then the broader question is, well, when do you step in? Why don't you step into Sudan? Why haven't we stepped into Congo? Why haven't we stepped into Myanmar? I understand those questions, and I'm not going to address right now. Those are hard questions. Those are real questions. But I want to go more basic, right? I'm not going to be able to work out all of realpolitik with you right now because we just won't be able to. We're not going to do that in 6 minutes, right? There'll be many more questions than answers. And again, one of the reasons I hesitated in addressing it, because you have to kind of address everything. It's very, 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 very deep. And it's very, 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 very hard, right, to actually understand what's going on by watching the news. You've got to actually look much deeper than the news. The news is an entertainment, outlet, right? And each news source has its own, set of biases. And the news sources today that are in the public space, right, are so wildly distorted, right, in the way they're reporting the news, right, is unimaginable, right? And again, tenderly, everybody, right, I've tracked this for 30, 40 years. I went to Israel, right, and I lived right next to Qalqilia. I was very, very, very close friends with many of the leaders of Qalqilia, one of the 4 major cities in the West Bank. I know the West Bank, inside out. Right? I refused to carry a machine gun walking through Qalqilia, even though people said I would get killed. And I said, no, these are my brothers. I won't do that. Right? I lived with an Arab family in Jaffa. Right? So this is none of this is strange or far from me. I keep in touch with a number of people in Gaza, right? Constantly. I check Gaza feeds every day and Israeli feeds every day. Right? So, and I have an enormous amount of critiques of the Israeli government. Right. Having said that, I will just make it clear, right, the moral equivalence between, right, the democratic Israel, right, and Hamas is insane and absurd, right, based on 1,000 pieces of information, which obviously I can't go through right now, right? So, right, but Habib has. So check it out. I want to talk about one topic today, right? And as I said, I referred everybody to a Rachel Maddow article. Right, which I said is an important article, and I said we're going to send to everyone, which offers a huge critique on the United States, which is a valid critique, and on the president, right? If you want to read, kind of like very, very important, kind of voices that are, profoundly supporting, right, what's happening now, there's quite a lot of those. You can see them in many, many places, but one of them in general is Sam Harris. Sam's done a very, very good job on this, I think. Douglas Murray, who's a little feisty, but, his positions are actually intelligent. And I think he's done, a very, very good job on it. But you can also look at Chuck Schumer, right, who understands, some very, very important things about this, right, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some very, very good voices out there, which are very, very important. I want to go to more basics. This is material that's been covered here and there by different people, right, both in the liberal side of the world and the conservative side of the world around the world, but it needs to be stated, explicitly. War itself is a horror. Does everyone get that? War is a horror. War is a horror. A bullet is a horror. Does that make sense? A bullet is a horror, right? A bullet is a horror. But it's not true that war is the crime. That's actually not true. That is a pacifist position. And pacifist thinking, I believe is wrong fundamentally, right? From the perspective of the field of value. And that's where I want to start. Okay. Right. In other words, I was sitting with the Dalai Lama, right? At his home, we're just the two of us in Dharamsala. And we were talking about right, it was right before we recorded a series of conversations. We had met in Castel Gandolfo in the Pope's summer residence, and we both talked about the absurdity of claiming that war itself is the crime. War is a horror. A bullet is a horror, right? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that there's never a just war. So I want to start with basics, right? Before we get to, I'm not going to talk today about, what's happened in the last day, right? I believe that this is a very, very complex moment. I believe fundamentally that it's unclear how this is going to turn out. I believe that Iran, right, not Iranians. Iranians are beautiful, but the government of Iran, right, has been an utter horror, has been, very close to evil incarnate, right? I believe that the massacring of tens of thousands of girls, women, right, the brutal, right, the brutality of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of the Houthis, right, needs to be kind of challenged in a very fundamental way, right? And right, the Dalai Lama and I, right, completely agreed on this point, which is that the notion that, right, that there are no just wars, right, is a fundamentally immoral notion, right? The notion that we should have actually allowed the Nazis to win World War II, right, would have caused, right, there were 55 million people killed in World War II, right? It would have been a far greater horror in the world had the Nazis not been defeated. So I want to just kind of say this clearly. I want to say this clearly. I am thankful. I am filled with gratitude, right? And the arrogance of suggesting of people who are living in democratic societies today, who kind of say, no, war's terrible. All wars are terrible, right? There's no just wars. And being kind of sarcastic, right? Yeah, right. No, all of us are sitting here today and having this conversation because there have been just wars. So I stand with my friend, the Dalai Lama, and I hope, he's got a little credibility here, right? And I hope I have a little credibility here. But it's not just the two of us, right? In other words, we got to really understand this in a very fundamental way, right? Should we have and you got to be very clear, you can't duck. Should we have let the Nazis win? Should we have let the Nazis win? The answer is no. I think there's an unequivocal, right, response to that. We should not have let the Nazis win. And you got to hold that. If you can't hold that, you're not in a serious conversation. Okay? Right? The Nazi, it's not okay for the Nazis to win. Okay? So that's number one. That's just number one. That's issue one. Not okay for the Nazis to win. And number two, if we could have stopped Hitler from doing what he did, would it have been moral, right, to take Hitler out? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, right? And I've debated many people over the last 20 years who said they wouldn't take Hitler out. They wouldn't do it, right? Because they're pacifists. And even if they had an opportunity to take Hitler out, they wouldn't do it, right? So I think that's fundamentally morally wrong, right? If we could have stopped Hitler and stopped World War II, right, I believe that we had an absolute moral obligation, an ethical obligation in the field of value, right, to do what? To take Hitler out. That's number two, right? And Chamberlain in the 30s, right, who allowed Hitler to take Sudetenland, right? And, Joseph Kennedy in the United States, who was actually kind of part of that, same movement, and the isolationist movement in the United States that actually not only allowed Hitler to come to power, but actually armed Hitler, right? Hitler was armed, and in a very, very significant way by, forces of industry, right, in the United States. And they're like, wow, it's kind of a big deal, right? That was tragic, right? In other words, we should not have allowed, we should have actually seen what was coming. We should have taken Mein Kampf seriously. We should have taken Mein Kampf seriously. So it's a very, very, fundamental realization. Now, to be clear, that has not been the realization of much of the Western world. So if you take a look at, for example, let me just say this. If during the Nazi era, democratic societies, right, had basically said, during the Nazi era, democratic societies have basically said, we're going to do pacifism, we're going to do nonviolence, right, then basically democracy and human rights themselves would have disappeared from the world. I want to say that sentence again. If during the Nazi era, right, democratic societies had said, hey, we're going to practice pacifism and nonviolence, then, right, democracy, right, and human rights, for all intents and purposes, would have disappeared from the world. Right? That's a very big deal. Okay, now that was not taken as a given. Actually, there were enormous amount of voices, right, that actually said, now Khomeini has said everything that Hitler said, directly and clearly. He said every single thing that Hitler has said, every single one. I've been reading him for 30 years. I know him backwards and forwards. I know the texts. I read the texts that come out of, right, his world and his clerics. He's saying every single thing that Hitler says, he says, and he says it 5 times over. I want you to get that. That is what he's saying. That is his intention. His intention, though, is not actually directed particularly at the small Satan, which is Israel. It's directed at the large Satan, which is Western Europe and the United States. Right? And what we would call the neoliberal world order, which his intention is, not only him, but the entire network that's been created, to destroy it in the most abject and horrific way. Right? His intention is clearly the same 1,000 times over. Let's make it really clear. That's what we're talking about. He just massacred 50,000 people. Right? That just let's understand. We're talking about, by any definition, right, of evil, by any definition of evil, right? He's on it. Not him particularly. It's not about a person. It's about the fundamental representation, right? We're talking about death cults, right? For whom the worst violations are actually fine, as long as they're being done to the one who's considered an infidel, right? Systemic and intentional. It's like, right? That's a big deal. Now, despite that fact, let's go back to Nazism, right? In other words, during kind of the, let's say, the Cold War in America against communism, right? And what happened, right? And I'm not Russian. I didn't grow up in Russia. I've read 10 books, but reading 10 books is not the same. I have quite a few friends over the years, right? But what Stalin did, are we for real? Right? Like, right? But in the United States, there was this embracing, right, of communism, right? And its ideals were quite powerful. And you can be quite inspired by the International, right? But there was this very strong liberal embrace of communism, right? So, for example, the Presbyterian Church, the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, right? They argued for various forms of unilateral disarmament, right? Unilateral disarmament. I just want you to get that. Just stay with the general thread, everyone. See if we can kind of go deep. Stay with the general thread. Unilateral disarmament, right? Various forms, right? The American Friends Service Committee, right? The Fellowship of Reconciliation. There were very, very, very strong voices. Catholic leaders, right? The Catholic Educational Association, right? Made disarmament, right? Nonviolence per se, their platform. It was basically a fundamental, platform of Catholic education. So, for example, Chester Finn Jr., right? Who is, a Vanderbilt University social critic, right? He was about, you got to teach unilateral disarmament every place, right? The Bishop of Seattle, right? Huntington, right? Called Puget Sound, right? Auschwitz, because there were nuclear submarines docked there. Okay, that's complicated. So nuclear submarines that were created to ostensibly protect democracy are the same as Auschwitz that was actively killing, right, and gassing, 20,000 people a day. Okay, it's a big deal. So let's just go slow for a second, guys, right? It's complicated, right? I have debated any number of reform rabbis, like within the Jewish context, who have said that if they could have killed Hitler, they would not have done it, even if they could have stopped World War II. Right now, I get the power of that. I get the power of that, but no, actually, right? If we could have killed Hitler, we should have killed him, right? And that's very, very big deal. And I want to try and get into this. Okay, so there's basically a bunch of reasons, why, right? There's a bunch of reasons why, why we're unable to articulate fundamental moral distinctions, right? Fundamental distinctions around value, right? And it's a very, very big deal. So, but I'm gonna just use this as an example, because had we actually followed the British Labour Party, right, the Greens in Germany, right, all supported unilateral disarmament, right, in the latter part of the Cold War. That's a big deal. The Physicians for Social Responsibility, same position. Okay, so how do these are decent, good people? I want to get this, because these are decent, good people. They aren't evil people. These are decent, good people. So how do decent, good people come to a place where they're embracing a position that the result of would lead to limitless cruelty? It's a very, very big deal. It's a very, very, very big deal. Okay, so stay close for a second. So there's a bunch of premises, and this has been pointed out, right? But I want to try and articulate it and deepen it. So assumption one, it's always wrong to kill another human being. Assumption one, right? Assumption two, let's say in the Judeo-Christian context, the 10 Commandments say thou shalt not kill. Assumption three, human life is a supreme value. It's the supreme value. Human life is the supreme value. Okay, here we go. Human life is the supreme value. That's three. Four, the best way, right, to combat evil is nonviolence. And then usually people cite, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Right? Well, that is the best way, right, to fight nonviolence always. Five, which is kind of a kind of sub, right, kind of a sub, right, ethic, right, a sub ethic, right, is you can't fight violence with violence. That's the premise. You can't fight violence with violence. Five. And then six is something like, I'll try and kind of get it, kind of something like the following, something like, right, before, this is kind of where Bertrand Russell said kind of better read than dead, right? Something like, before nuclear weapons, right, there might have been a place for just wars, but now that there are nuclear weapons, there's no place for any just wars whatsoever. Okay, so those are kind of six powerful positions. They're all powerful. They all have some allurement, right? They all have some beauty. They all have some depth, and they're all wrong. Every single one of those premises is wrong. Okay, and we have to train ourselves to think, and we have to be willing to bracket our own voices in order to actually open. They all allow evil to thrive. That's absolutely correct. They all allow evil to thrive. That's a very big deal. So number one, let's go to number one. So it's always wrong to kill another human being. That's simply not the case. It's not always wrong to kill another human being. That's simply not true, right? Because the moment you affirm the morality, you say, okay, it would have been moral to kill Hitler, or it would be moral to stop a sniper from shooting other people, right? What you're saying is correctly that there's not an absolute statement that it's always moral to kill another human being. So sometimes, right, you have to kill another human being in order to protect innocent human life, right? That's true. So sometimes it's clear, right? It's almost never okay to kill another human being, obviously, but it's not always true. That's not always true. I just want you to get that, okay? And sometimes it's not clear. So the Allied bombing of cities in Germany, right, during World War II is a complex issue, right? I've looked at it very carefully over many years. I don't want to talk about it now, but it's a complex issue, right? And there were, 100,000 people killed, right? Men, women, and children. Many, many innocent people, right? Quote, innocent Germans. Now, were there innocent Germans in World War II? Of course there were. Of course there were innocent Germans who hated Nazis. Right? Are there any innocent people in Gaza? Of course there are. Of course there are. So a deep conversation about Germany. There's a deep conversation about Gaza, but that's not the point. I'm not having that conversation right now because you can't have every conversation in every second. But it's complicated. And if you're not willing to engage the complexity in your heart and bracket for a second, right, then you can't get anywhere, right? It was a very complex decision about how to bomb which German cities, how much to bomb, right? Was Dresden overbombed, for example, or wasn't it? Were there ulterior? But you got to look really carefully about that, right? And we weren't seeing clips of it on the news every day, but believe me, the bombing of German cities, right, looked horrific, horrible. The images were horrible. Boys and girls being killed. Let's get clear. Had someone killed Stalin in 1927, that would have been a good thing to do. So I want to say it really clearly, right? I would have killed Stalin in 1927. I was just at my mother's. My mother is in a very, very difficult, health place. And so I went to Israel really to see her. And she described to me, just hold on to this for a second, my friends, her mother meeting Hitler. It's like, wow. It's like intense, right? It's like, wow, her mother met Hitler. I won't tell you how and where and why. It's a deep, deep old story in my family. And the issue, of course, is not what would have changed if someone killed Stalin. The issue is the principle right now. The principle right now is on principle. If I could stop a horror by killing a person at a particular time, and we don't always know, but there are moments when that's the right thing to do, 1,000%. That's a big deal. And we don't always have the luxury of perfect moral clarity. Sometimes we do. And sometimes we have to take unique risks. And actually, right, sometimes leaders have to take unique risks. And it's very easy to discuss things in a chat box. But actually, when you're in a position of leadership and you're actually responsible, you have to actually make very, very, very hard decisions that are very complex. And if you don't hold the enormous agony of that complexity and you're totally clear and you don't realize I've got to be able to identify evil, right? And then stop it, right? That you're missing something fundamental in reality. Okay, that's a very big deal. So that's one. Two, well, Mark, what about the 10 Commandments? 10 Commandments say, thou shalt not kill. I thought you were like a 10 Commandment guy, Mark. No, the 10 Commandments, this is number 2. 10 Commandments do not say thou shalt not kill. They don't say that. There's no place in the 10 Commandments, my friends. It doesn't exist. Not there. It says thou shalt not murder, lo tirtzach. The Hebrew word is for murder, tirtzach, is not the same as the word laharog, to kill. So there is not a commandment. There is not a commandment. There's no commandment. Thou shalt not kill. It's thou shalt not murder. And there is an equal and commensurate fucking obligation to stop evil and to actually pretend that, oh, we're going to ignore that obligation, right? We've got full moral clarity. if I would hear, when I hear from a friend, a student, a friend, a colleague, when I hear the agony of the complexity, I'm in the conversation. When I hear moral platitudes and no agony and no complexity and no dialectical tension, just like, no, stop. We are commanded as human beings to destroy evil. It's a big deal. That's a big deal. And imagine you are the leader. You're not commenting in a chat box. You are responsible for evil. You're responsible to respond to evil. You have to make the decisions. Step into that, right? Feel that, right? That's part of outrageous love. That's part of what outrageous love is. Part of outrageous love is responding to evil. And you can't ignore that. We can't bracket that. There's a let me, if you guys, if you'll allow me for a second, okay? If you'll allow me for a second, let's just take a look, and let's go step by step. Go step by step. So I'm going to open a text, okay? So this is the story of Moses. This is the Moses story, and it's in the book of Exodus. And how does Moses become Moses? So Moses become Moses because, right, Vayetze el achav, he goes forth into society, like Buddha went forth into society, right? Vayar b'sivlotam, and he saw the suffering. Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri, and he saw an Egyptian overlord, right, smiting a slave. Vayifen kovacho, and then what he does is vayachat mitzri, he kills the Egyptian, and he buries him in the sand. Huh? Wow. That's the Moses story. It's not all of the Moses story, but that's the Moses story. Let's get that straight. And now, let me be really clear. That's right. Let me be really clear. The same Moses story, right? In the same text. Let's fast forward to Isaiah. And Isaiah writes, right? What's the vision? The vision is v'chitatu charvotam li'itim. You shall beat your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev. No nation should ever lift forth a sword against another nation. V'lo yilmedu od milchaman. Let's no longer be studied in the horror of warfare. That's the vision. That's the prophetic vision. Of course, that's the prophetic vision. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev. No nation should lift up sword against any other nation. V'lo yilmedu od milchaman. Let's not be studied in war. My point is that the same text that holds Moses as becoming Moses by standing for justice in a particular moment and slaying the Egyptian, the very same text holds the vision of Isaiah. No nation shall lift up sword against nation, and they shall not learn war anymore. Huh? Did you get that? Like, wow. Okay. Third point. Friends, you with me? Third point. The third argument for pacifism is that human life is the supreme value, right? So I just want to get this really clear. That is not true. That is simply not true. Human life is not the supreme value. So, for example, if you tell me I'm going to kill you, stay with me really close, unless you kill those 10 children, I have to give up my life. Let's go even deeper. Let's say, and let's kind of hear it for a second, because it's a big deal, right? If I had to take the life of the German and Japanese doctors, right, who performed the most grotesque experiments on human beings during World War II, I would, for sure, right? And it's really important. In other words, human life is a critical value, but there's a gamut of values in which life is one of them. But our job is not to live as long and as comfortable as we can, right? Actually, to be a human being, and particularly to be a leader, is to consider the field of human life. And that's why we fought the Nazis in World War II. I want to show you a scene for a second, okay? I want to show you a scene. Krista, you with me? We're just going to take 2 minutes, okay? I'm going to show you the opening scene of a movie. It's an incredible movie, okay? Right? Take a look. Okay, take a look. Here's the opening scene of a movie, okay? These are boys in Kansas and Montana who are about to storm the beaches of Normandy. Most of them are about to get killed. Moving forward.
Plenty of beef between men. 5 men is a juicy opportunity. 1 man's a waste of ammo.
Stand out of your weapons. Keep those actions clear. I'll see you on the beach.
All right. Hold it there. We could play the whole scene. You got the point. Now stay with me for a second. Stay with me for a second. Do you think that the people they were shooting at, right, experienced themselves as being evil? The Germans? Do you think that the Germans they were shooting at didn't have children and girlfriends and didn't have kind moments and didn't make love? Of course they did, right? That's the point, right? You know, and they were fighting for Hitler, right? They were fighting for Hitler. I want you to get that clear. I want you to get that clear. And had they not stormed those beaches, right, we probably wouldn't be in this conversation in this way, in this moment in time. That's a big deal. In other words, when we argue, when the third argument for pacifism is human life is the supreme value, what it's saying is biology takes precedence over value, right? In other words, living as long as you can, right, and being alive is the ultimate value, which is a quite stupid ultimate value because everyone's going to die. Right now, there'll be a continuity of consciousness. It's a different conversation, but death happens. And so when I make life, and that was the exact point, it was that beautiful movie, right, that Heath Ledger actually died right after he made. He played Batman, in which the Joker wants to show that everyone just wants to live, that life is the ultimate value, and that no one actually really holds any real field of value. So in that Batman movie with Heath Ledger, the Joker, right, connects 2 boats. And he says to each boat, I'll let you guys survive if you blow up the other boat. Right? And in the end, they refuse, and the Joker goes mad because actually they chose value over their own lives. That's what it means to be a human being, my friends. What it means to be, now, of course, we need to discern what value. And of course, how many people have died in Christ, in the name of Christ, I can't believe it all, sang Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. And of course, there are false values and there are false causes. I understand that. But first, let's get the basic, you got to start with the beginning. What's the basic understanding, right? Is that human life is not the supreme value, right? In other words, good lives are more important than long lives. Goodness is ultimately more important than life. And the life in this world is not all there is. There's a larger vision. Now, can that be perverted? Can that be, hijacked, by visions of fundamentalism, which say I'm going to kill you in order to get you to heaven. Of course it can be. Of course that's a perversion and a degradation. Of course it is. I understand that. Of course we understand that. But that doesn't mean that we actually say, because life is the only value, we're not going to fight Nazism. No, we will, because there's something higher than life. And every kid on that beach that we just saw at the opening of the movie Saving Private Ryan, from Montana and Kansas and Idaho, right, who rolls out on that beach and knows that I have a very good chance of not surviving this beach, was saying that I'm a hero. And what is a hero? A hero means that I realize that there's a larger field of value to which I am in devotion, for which I'm willing to sacrifice my life. That's a shocking realization of enlightenment, right? The hero has a moment of enlightenment. Every one of those kids on that beach had a moment of enlightenment. They were willing, right, to sacrifice life for a higher vision. Now, stay very close to me. Does that not mean there are false causes? Of course there's false causes. Of course there are. Of course there are. Of course there are suicide bombers, right? Of course there are, who go into a cafe and blow themselves up. And I've seen it happen, right? I just missed getting blown up by a second on one particular day, and on Ben Yehuda Street in the middle of Jerusalem, just literally, just barely, right? And I've been very, very close as school buses blew up, right? I understand there's false causes, but the fact that there's false causes doesn't mean there's not just causes, right? Obviously, yet you can't respond. Does everyone get that? You cannot respond to evil by saying, you guys got the field, we're withdrawing from the field. Can't do that. You have to be willing to fight for a just cause. And I have to be willing to give up my life for the sake of a just cause, right? If there's nothing I'm willing to die for, I'm not alive. That's a very, very big deal. So that's 3. Everyone get that? That's 3. So it's a big deal, right? In other words, and the idea that human life itself is the ultimate value doesn't even succeed on its own grounds, because there'll be much less life. It'll destroy life, right? And what happens is, when we step out of the field of value and we don't have a sense that there's a larger field of value that's real, and that there's a set of values, uniqueness, integrity, creativity, fairness, justice, when I step out of the field of value, then the violations of Khamenei in Iran seem like nothing. And then we stop being able to, we actually lose the ability to bracket ourselves, to listen. We get caught in broken information ecologies. And we actually can't make moral discernments, right? Like, right? If we don't first defeat evil, Joycey, there's no conversation, right? Joycey's not living her life, right? Within a secular liberal context, doing spiritual development. Doesn't exist. That's a big deal. Okay. Like, wow. So try and stay with it. Try and again, bracket yourself and actually follow the thread of the argument, because that demonstrates a kind of maturity and an ability to actually integrate information. Slow it down. Okay. Slow it down and try and understand. The first 4, nonviolence is the best way to resist evil. Okay. Is that true? No, it's not. It's not true. Nonviolence is not the best way to defeat evil. Now, let's go clear. If you're Gandhi or you're Martin Luther King, so Gandhi is fighting the British Empire, and the British Empire did many evils, to be clear, but it lived in a field of value. So therefore, you could challenge the British Empire with nonviolence, because there was some shared field of value between Gandhi and the British troops that he was opposing. Does everyone get that? When Martin Luther King went to challenge, right, the horror of segregation, right, which went on, for 100 years, from Jim Crow to redlining, right, in the United States, and the horrific lynchings in the South, right? It's an unimaginably important and tragic story. When Martin Luther King went to challenge the United States, he was challenging the United States because both Martin Luther King, right, and the United States were in a shared field of value. Imperfect, but a shared field of value. And so therefore, nonviolence did something, right? And yes, there were people killed, right, during the protests in the South, but I want you to compare what happened with the nonviolent protests, right, of the civil rights movement and what happened in Iran. In Iran, they just mowed down 50,000 people. Do you get that? At Kent State, when 3 people were killed, the nation was horrified. Correctly. You can't compare those two. If you're not able to make that discernment, you're out of the conversation, right? It's Kent State is not the square in Tehran, right? One killed 3 people and the country was horrified. The other killed 50,000 people. And the government thought it was fine. It was fine. If you can't make that distinction, we're in trouble. Now, again, there's not one bone in my body that's whitewashing, right, the moral turpitude that has different moments in the United States. Of course not. We're not whitewashing the United States, but we're making a distinction. If you can't distinguish between a liberal democracy, right, and between a death cult, we're in very big trouble. If you can't distinguish between the founding documents of Khamenei, right, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, all of which I've read. How many people have read the founding documents of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? You should read them. They read quite different than the Constitution of the United States, right, and the Bill of Rights. Everyone outside of their particular social circle is an infidel for which you get to do what Hamas did in October 2023. And you got to get that distinction, my friends, or the conversation doesn't start. And by the way, Gandhi himself didn't get the distinction. Stay with me. Gandhi didn't get the distinction. Stay close. Stay close. Stay close. Stay close. Stay close. Gandhi writes, right? Gandhi writes to the Jews in Germany. I want to tell you what he says. And he was dead wrong, right? Gandhi says, I am as certain as I am dictating these lines, that the stoniest German heart will melt if only the Jews adopt active nonviolence. I want you to get this again. Get this again. I want everyone to get this again. It's dead wrong. Gandhi writes this in 1938. He writes to the Jews of Germany. I want you to get it again. He just didn't get evil. He didn't get it. He didn't get it. He simply did not get evil. He did not understand evil. Right? I want you to get this again. I am as certain as I am dictating these lines that the stoniest German heart will melt if only the Jews adopt active nonviolence. He writes, I do not despair of his, he means Hitler's, I do not despair of Hitler's responding to human suffering, even though caused by him. Did everyone get that? Everyone had that? Who got that? Who got that? That's like, did everyone get that? Who got that? Is that insane? Is that insane? In 1942, let's go on. In 1940, that was 1938. In 1942, Gandhi, stay close. Stay close. In 1942, listen up, my friends, brothers, sisters, listen up. It's a big deal. 1942, Gandhi, right, writes an open letter to the British, and it's called Nonviolence in Peace and War. Okay? Here's what he says. I would like you, the British, to lay down the arms you have as being useless for saving you or humanity. You will invite Herr Hitler and Signor Mussolini to take what they want of the countries you call your possessions. If these gentlemen choose to occupy your homes, you will vacate them. If they do not give you free passage out, you will allow yourselves, man, woman, and child, to be slaughtered, but you will refuse to owe allegiance to them. Everyone get that? That's Gandhi. That's Gandhi. But get that, right? Gandhi's not a bad guy. He's a complicated guy. Gandhi was quite complicated, but definitely not a bad guy. Like, oh my God, right? Wow. 2 more. 5. Last two. Right? 1. This is number 5. This is the fifth argument. You can't fight violence with violence. Right? And the essence of this argument is that when you fight violence with violence, you're fighting evil with evil. Then you become the moral equivalent of the person that you're fighting. That's just not true. It's not true, right? Violence is sometimes necessary to achieve good aims. Now, that can be wildly distorted. That's an unimaginably dangerous sentence to say, but it's true. That's why Gandhi was wrong. The British should not have laid down their arms, right? Thank God Churchill threw the letter out, right? Churchill, wild, crazy man who understood in the moral fiber of his being at his best that you have to fight violence with violence. That's just absolutely true. Right? And finally, the fact that there are nuclear weapons should not make us into pacifists. It makes the entire thing infinitely more dangerous. That's for sure. And it also means that we have to actually prevent rogue actors, right, who don't believe in fundamental value, right, from getting nuclear weapons. That's a very big deal. That's the point of this war. That's quite a good point. That's quite a good point. Okay? That's quite a good point. Got to be able to make those distinctions, my friends.